The best way to survive a nuclear attack is to be far from the action in the first place. But where? Let's talk about the places on Earth that just might become the cradle of life if World War III comes to pass. Here's the bad news. If World War III ended up being a massive nuclear event, as we can all foresee it being, there's no real safe place on Earth, only safer places.
In the first strike, you're going to have something in the order of 600 to 700 ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads from both countries flying against each other.
According to computer simulations run by the University of Southampton's Dr. Becky Alexis Martin and the University of Warwick's Dr. Tom Davies, one of humankind's best bets is also one of the most inconvenient: Antarctica. The continent is protected by a few things, including the undeniably remote location, a long-time nuclear weapons ban, and the simple fact that there wouldn't be much of a reason for warring countries to waste resources nuking it. That's not to say it wouldn't be impacted by World War III, because it absolutely would. Research done by the American Association for the Advancement of Science found that among the lasting impacts of nuclear war would be widespread climate change, including a warming of the poles. That's supported by a study published in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Oceans, which projected major changes for Antarctica. Nuclear war in a warming climate would trigger the melting of up to 30% of the sea ice surrounding the continent, which would kick off global cooling and rising waters, which means that not all of Antarctica would be a safe place to settle. The coasts would likely flood in a domino effect of shifting warmer winds, warming oceans, and melting ice.
Scientists have estimated that the Antarctic ice sheets hold enough ice to raise sea levels by 58 meters.
So if Antarctica is the final destination, stay away from the coast. In 2022, Rutgers University spearheaded a study that looked at the consequences of the nuclear war that would inevitably come with World War III. They were specifically interested in global food supplies following conflict, detonation, and nuclear winter, and it was pretty dire stuff. Nuclear weapons detonated on even a relatively small scale resulted in the decimation of the world's food production, and that's where Argentina comes in. In an interview with Science Friday, study leader Dr. Alan Roebuck suggested that the key to survival wasn't just being where the nukes weren't, but it also meant being in a place that could sustain itself afterward. There is, after all, no point surviving the initial conflict only to die of starvation, exposure, or some other horrible consequence in the following years, and Argentina might just have what it takes. When he name-checked Argentina as one of the likely candidates, Roebuck explained, "We assumed that trade would stop. Like we hoarded toilet paper during the pandemic, people would keep their food. So a few countries that don't have many people that are big exporters now would have enough food, places like Argentina or Australia." Tech innovator and entrepreneur Martin Varsavsky agrees, to the point where he and 6 others bought a ranch in Argentina to be sure they're prepared for just such an eventuality. He explained on X that Argentina was a perfect sanctuary. Along with its agricultural self-sufficiency, he also pointed to their non-intervention policies, remoteness from conflict hotspots, and the fact that it's unlikely to be a major target. Along with Argentina, Dr. Roebuck gave Australia a shout-out in an interview where he spoke about surviving a post-apocalyptic nuclear winter and the inevitable food shortages that would follow.
Scientists say a nuclear winter will freeze the Earth for about 2 decades.
And in an interview with Cosmos, study co-author Dr. Ryan Hennigan from Queensland University explained Australia's very southern location positioned it on the other side of the globe from where nuclear weapons were likely to be deployed, giving it some protection, although it would still see impacts from soot and debris that ends up in the air. Australia, however, is likely big, rich, expansive, and self-sufficient enough to weather not only the fallout, but the collapse of international trade. In a study published in Discrete Dynamics in Nature and Society in 2022, Australia was named one of the best places to be in case of nuclear war. Why? In addition to their food production capabilities, they get points for being self-sufficient in terms of energy generation use and surplus, solid, reliable infrastructure, localized governments capable of planning for natural disasters like bushfires and floods, the presence of nearby trading partners, sustainable healthcare, and a standing military. Hennigan also explained why it's difficult to find a so-called safe country, adding, "There really is no such thing as a regional nuclear war. There's conflict in the world at the moment that's non-nuclear and we don't feel the effects of it, but that wouldn't be the case with a regional nuclear war." That said, Australia does have some major things going for it. Iceland is a tricky one. While it's likely to be impacted by the nuclear weapons detonated as part of World War III, it does have some things going for it that would make it likely to become a refuge. Starting with the fact that while they don't bear the burden of funding and feeding a standing army, they do have coastal and air defense facilities. Even if it were to be a target, the likelihood of a strike is small. That's the first very important step to safety. They're one of a few countries named as a potential safe space in a 2022 study published in Discrete Dynamics in Nature and Society, which found that Iceland's location presented it with a unique benefit. Climate models suggest that the island nation would suffer impacts of nuclear winter that are much less pronounced than what would destroy other countries in the northern hemisphere. They also rely on hydroelectric power, are increasingly dependent on hydrogen fuel, and since they don't rely heavily on imports, the failure of the world's trade networks wouldn't be as badly felt. Back in 2019, the Reykjavik Grapevine looked at how well prepared to face nuclear threats Iceland was, and confirmed that there was a plan in place. It included increasing stocks of iodine tablets, which will save lives in the case of nuclear fallout. Taking iodine overloads the thyroid and prevents it from absorbing radioactive iodine-131. And there's even more good news for Iceland. Native species of kelp are a naturally occurring source of this life-saving mineral. The 2022 study published in Discrete Dynamics in Nature and Society found that there were a lot of similarities between New Zealand and Australia, as far as survivability after a massive nuclear event. Like Australia, New Zealand is capable of producing enough food to support their population. They're 76% energy self-sufficient and have a highly educated population, which is important since they're likely to face major problems relatively quickly. Study authors did point out that the difficulties of moving products between islands would likely put a massive strain on energy resources. New Zealand relies on imports for key items like chemicals, oil, and rubber, which could result in something of a domino effect, eventually destabilizing the nation. Study authors write, "This situation may require strict maintenance of law and order, particularly if rationing of fuel, healthcare, or even food is required. Risk of unrest is probably increased if such plans are not publicized ahead of time." In other words, New Zealand might survive, but in a Mad Max kind of way. While many of the safer places in the world rely on being completely out of the way if World War III were to break out, Switzerland sits right in the middle of what's likely to be a major conflict. However, they have a few major things going for them, starting with their long-standing policy of neutrality. Switzerland's neutrality policy held out through the first two world wars, so it's likely to last through the third.
What are your thoughts on this momentous occasion, your neutralness?
I have no strong feelings one way or the other.
But they also have something else, a massive series of nuclear shelters with enough space for each and every person, and then some. As of 2022, Switzerland has a population of 8.6 million, and bunkers to support almost 9 million people. And they're everywhere. Shelters were mostly built during the Cold War, were constructed inside and beneath buildings, and have been used for everything from storage to wine cellars in the decades since.
Within the last 15 years, we built around 6,000 large bunkers, up to 500 people.
They're outfitted with everything you need to survive a nuclear attack. And Nicola Schilacci, head of Geneva's Civil Protection and Military Affairs Division, explained, "It is like a capsule with airlocks on emergency exits and main exits. If the building were to collapse, the shelter would remain intact." Switzerland's population has been prepped to know exactly what to do in case World War III does happen. In 2022, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace took an in-depth look at Indonesia. In particular, they were interested in their stance on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and both countries made it clear that they were staying neutral.
The war in Ukraine is reigniting fears of a radioactive dirty bomb.
Indonesian President Joko Widodo stated, "We should not divide the world into parts. We must not allow the world to fall into another Cold War." Both countries rely on imports from both Russia and Ukraine, but according to Discrete Dynamics in Nature and Society, that's precisely the attitude that got them on this list. While it was forecasted that Indonesia might struggle with food supplies, maintaining friendly relations and trade with Australia could, in theory, help relieve those problems. In the meantime, Indonesia's neutrality means it's unlikely to be a target. Add in their ability to produce far more energy than they consume, and the likelihood that their location will protect them from the worst of a nuclear winter, and that makes them an invaluable cornerstone to area stability. Indonesia and the Philippines both have something else going for them: strong local governments and small local populations with close ties. While some problems, like the potential for volcanic activity and less than ideal infrastructure, mean that while it might not be a paradise on Earth, it would likely be a reasonably safe place. When Dr. Alexis Martin and Dr. Davies used computer models to simulate the massive nuclear annihilation that would likely come with World War III, they found that getting as far as possible away from conflict and nuclear detonation hotspots really did make a difference. Where better to do that than in the middle of the Pacific? In a piece for The Guardian, they wrote that Easter Island, the Marshall Islands, and Kiribati would likely offer safety to those living there. Discrete Dynamics in Nature and Society added the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu to that list. Countless other small islands would undoubtedly afford much the same protections as these, and while the creature comforts we're used to might become scarce, that's a small price to pay for life.
Decontamination may be necessary. You may have to burn or bury all your clothes and food, and afterwards you should wash thoroughly.
Study authors found that many of these island nations had lifestyles that allowed them to flourish under circumstances that could cause many other nations to flounder. They cited things like continued reliance on what they described as traditional and low-technology production methods, which would allow civilizations to continue to produce food and other essentials in the face of a loss of imports, communications, and trade options. And in the fact that some are close enough to maintain a relationship with Australia and New Zealand, and it seems likely that these isolated island nations could be some of the best options for surviving World War III. All in all, there won't be many safe places once World War III begins. Looking back at the death tolls, widespread devastation, and horrific aftermath of World War II gives us a general idea of what World War III might bring. And let's just say there's a reason for the quote that is often attributed to Albert Einstein, who reportedly said, "I do not know with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones."
Those who die in the thermonuclear fireballs may be the lucky ones.
World War III has almost kicked off a number of times, but how likely is it? While many experts say it's unlikely the conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine will escalate into a world war, others are quick to point out that the previous two world wars also began as localized conflicts that eventually enveloped the globe. When asked how likely World War III actually is, Sky News security and defense editor Deborah Haynes replied, "More likely not than at any time since the end of the last World War."
The prospect of nuclear conflict, once unthinkable, is now back within the realm of possibility.
And even more unsettling was the opinion of Hugh Lovett, senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, who said, "The international order is fraying."